Hey, welcome to DevSecOps, the good, the bad, the ugly. Today I have with me Yaniv, all the way from Israel. Yaniv, thanks for joining.
Hey, pleasure. Thank you.
So Yaniv, I was telling you just before kicking off the interview that I spoke with a gentleman named Jeff Lockwood about making sure that your data management strategy before going to the cloud is a critical part for an organization. I know that you've been involved in data management for a while. Can you talk about some strategies for organizations to make sure that they are managing their data well?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So one of the biggest challenges in migrating to the cloud and implementing, essentially processes that are more modern is that everything is based on automation and APIs, and it's not like the good old days where a person connected to the database type in some commands and dealt with the feedback. You to deal with variety of databases. They're not local. You have to build proper security processes. Who can connect to where should you actually access and be allowed to access, and what information you should be able to see. So there's a lot of processes that have to be implemented in order to have things spun up properly on the cloud. So I think the best thing to do is to make sure that your processes are properly automated, meaning even if you try building them or start building them when you're on-prem, the more repeatable the process is, the safer and more easier transition would be to the cloud. If you're coming from a completely manual process and trying to do everything on cloud, then it's not going to be efficient. It's going to be risky. So these are definitely things that needs to be catered for.
Yeah, that's great, Yaniv. So a trend that I've noticed is that a lot of times organizations are lagging in delivering on database management, right? And actually releasing quickly there. Can you talk about why?
Yes, so we've actually been following this specific topic for several years now. We're doing annual surveys. So we actually see the gaps between application implementation of DevOps and CI/CD processes versus the database. So obviously, as you said, the first thing is that there's an obvious gap. The database is lagging behind. It is improving step by step, especially in the last, I think, year and a half. Right. But I think what's obvious to see is that when you talk to companies about, how do you approach your DevOps, how you approach your CI/CD, they immediately can tell you about their Jenkins and Jiras and this automation and that automation and implementing Git and branches. They can tell you all about it. But when you start talking about the database, and especially if that's something which is a bit more legacy, I don't know, a big system that resides on Oracle, MS SQL, or whatever, then you see that they become much more cautious and they don't want to automate and go too quickly because of potential risk. Who is entitled to actually do changes or initiate them? And that is the first thing that usually creates the gap. So you see like a curve where the database is just trailing the application. I would say in about 2 years of a lag. So usually when I learn about someone who tries to deal with that lagging part of the process, it's about 1.5 to 2 years after they started implementing DevOps for their application, and they realized that they gain a lot of good results on the application side. Once you start building these processes, you get a lot of value. So the process becomes more and more rigid, on the good side of rigid, meaning it's repeatable. It's safer. Documentation is built into the process. Traceability is there. And then you do some stuff manually, completely manually. Right. So this is where they realize, okay, we have benefit here, and we want to get that also for security, database infrastructure as well.
Yeah. So what are some of the common challenges that I'm sure other people are have witnessed or experienced themselves that you can maybe share that you've noticed?
Yeah, actually, I mentioned the survey. This is actually one of the, I think, the key sections that I tend to talk about more, because it's really out there in your face.
Right.
Problems that are unique to the database world, things that, when you release software, a new version, you just take the executables, the files, you just dump it in the correct way, you register the right files,
Mm-hmm.
and you just put the latest version. But for the database, changes cannot be done like that. You have your data, it has to be persistent. Changes to the database are incremental in nature. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to be very knowledgeable about what's already in there. So, things that challenge people, like, because from previous question, they don't have a repeatable automated process in a lot of cases, then the configuration tends to drift. You tend to have maybe differences between different environments. You have something in development, it works right. QA was tested a bit differently. Something was not deployed to production, or a hotfix was deployed to production and never found its way back to other environments. So there's
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of gaps and drifts that really come up from a process which is not properly built and not really automated
Right.
for repeatability. So we tend to see a lot of challenges about drift. I think this is the number one reason, quoted by 75% of the people in that survey that I mentioned, about the number one thing that breaks their database releases. And there's other things, someone saved the date, fixed something in the database, it's not documented, you don't know about it. Next release might override it and nobody would even know about it. So
Right.
documentation and traceability and other things are really lacking in this aspect.
So that's great, Yaniv. So with that, what are some things that organizations can do kind of incrementally to get better or to speed up their database process?
Yeah, so this is really something that has been cracked. So this problem is solved already on the application side of things. You have best practices, you have design patterns to how to do that. So things like build your code once and deploy it the same way to all environments is something that nobody would do differently for application code. Nobody would try to write code directly to production or change or tweak changes directly in production for applications. Yet for the database, you see that happening. So it's all about making sure that you follow the same patterns, the same
Okay.
successful proven patterns. So this is the number one thing. Other things are really breaking silos. Database traditionally was a DBA thing.
Mm-hmm.
DBAs are very protective, obviously, of what we entrusted them in keeping, and sometimes that gets to be a bottleneck in an agile way of work, because you bombard, development teams bombard DBA with, do that, I need this, please help me do this,
Right.
and they just they keep doing more and more. But because of agile thinking, changes are becoming smaller and smaller, but the frequency gets higher and higher. So it's kind of a thing that takes more and more of your time. We actually measured in the last 2 years, uh, um, DBA team invest double the time now than they did 2 years ago in just delivering changes.
Right.
And there's no glory in that.
Right.
It's work. It's not a
Right.
specialization. You don't use all of the things that you want to do, but you have to do it. So I
Right.
think maybe one of the biggest things on top of best practices is building a process that is really balancing dev versus database people.
Right.
Creating common grounds of or equilibrium, how to actually create a process that dev are focusing on what's safe and how to do that,
Yep.
and you can open up the floodgates without having garbage in garbage out kind of a thing that nobody really wants.
Yeah,
So
great. Do you
that is,
typically recommend to start with small batch sizes with that when you're beginning to do the work, like for the dev folks to work with the database?
yeah, absolutely. So many times, you may start from maybe logic, just code within the database that like procedures and stuff. This is closer to application coding than anything else. And what I see is that usually this is the first thing that dev team get responsibility for, and later on add more changes, for the core schema and the structure of things. But I think that as long as you create a policy and you put the ground rules, then it's easier for everybody to know what's safe and makes sense and whatnot. So if a developer would want to drop a table, and he could do it, and there would be no like filtering process in the way saying no, this is risky, then potentially any such issue could come through. And this is where the challenge comes in. You want to let everybody work faster, but you don't want big mistakes to get in. So
Right.
people are used to saying, move fast and break things, but nobody wants to break the database
Right.
because the cost of damage here is really great. So using tools to do code scanning to make sure that you don't do risky actions, you don't grant something too wide or too deep, so you don't open up your database to be hacked, and you don't do anything that might result in data loss. So you're almost there, from a safety perspective.
Right.
But rules and enforcing them is usually what makes the whole thing flow easier, because this is when database people feel better to just let people, okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
I know you wouldn't get to me, okay, go ahead and do what you need, and if something is wrong, then it should not be something really bad.
Right. Yeah. The rules make the database people comfortable with those changes, right? Because they know what
Yeah.
that's going to look like. It's been outlined. So, hey, Yaniv, this is very helpful, very enlightening. Appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Pleasure.